Hello, my name is Eric Weaver, and this is my Module 2 presentation on the creation myths. So, for this project, we were asked to review the Genesis 1 through 3, Enuma Elish, Theogony, and the selection from Hesiod Works and Days, and to evaluate them culturally and then comparatively. Well, without further ado, let's just get started. One thing that you will notice when I'm going through these to start, we're going to review them culturally first, and you're going to see these same questions repeated throughout. And this is a really good set of questions that can be used to look for what is culturally significant in a story. So with Genesis 1 through 3, what is weird? Well, to me, in this story, an all-powerful being created the world in 6 days. While those who believe in this myth may not find it weird, given that there is an all-powerful being, my question is, how and why did this being created, and the order and the way it chose to, That was one thing that I found weird. Who speaks throughout the story? Well, throughout the entire story, the one who speaks the most is God. I feel, I'll get into that a little bit later on. What is repeated? The phrases "and God" or "and the Lord" are repeated often throughout the story. So, like I was just saying with the last one, I feel like these, the fact that God throughout Genesis in these first couple of chapters is the main one who speaks, and then, "and God" or "and the Lord" is the way that they start most every passage or line. It makes me feel like this story is told through his perspective or their perspective. And then what receives a long description? Well, the longest description in the story is the creation of the world. I believe that receives a full chapter in the Genesis story. When things are longer or have really long description that shows their importance, and of course the creation of the world in this story is kind of the important part, right? That's how they set the foundation for everything that this myth goes into later on. So anyway, what does this all mean? Well, from all of this, we can assume that the people that created and worship and use Genesis or use the myths consistently, we can assume that they are culturally bound to moral obligation, right? Throughout the stories, we see, Eve, Adam and Eve, don't take the apple and all that. You're bound to be morally upright or do the right thing in these stories as a human. And I feel like that's one of the lessons that's taken away by the ancient peoples. Another thing that can be taken away from this is the fact that there is an all-powerful God. To the people that do believe in this, I don't want to really get into that too much, just because that's still a modern religion that's very practiced to this day, and people have very divisive opinions on it, but that is something that can be taken away from this story. And then next up, we're going to be looking at the Sumerian creation story, Enuma Elish, or Elish. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. Same exact questions as we asked with Genesis. Like I said, we're going to see these throughout our cultural analysis. So what was weird? One thing that I found pretty weird was Tiamat at first saves her children, plots with her children to kill her husband and let them continue to play and do whatever they're going to do. But later in the story, she falls to the same issue, I guess, where she seeks the same exact evil that her husband wanted to do for the same reason. While there is definitely a play of, the devil's advocate or the devil on your shoulder in these stories, that is definitely something that stood out to me. Who speaks in the story? Well, Marduk and Tiamat, with other gods, all receiving smaller dialogue. By far the most dialogue, though, goes to Marduk and then Tiamat. In these stories, it's not super often that dialogue is used, but when it is, it's significant. And so the fact that Tiamat and Marduk receive multiple lines of dialogue shows that they have a significant role in these stories, right? That we should be paying attention to them. What is repeated? Well, the idea of betrayal, trickery to cause chaos. So, like I was saying a little bit earlier, Tiamat was kind of convinced that she should kill her children because they were being too loud, right? And later on, there is another betrayal and trickery of Marduk by King Nu. I'm not sure how you say it. I'll probably butcher tons of these names, but I'll try anyway. The idea of betrayal and trickery to cause chaos or sow seeds of chaos is pretty relevant throughout these stories. And then what receives a long description? Well, the description and celebration of Marduk receives by far the longest description. This really just shows how important Marduk was to these ancient people, and kind of points out to us that we need to pay attention to whatever he does, right? Just as the ancient peoples would have been paying attention and wanted to emulate his actions, we need to pay attention to what he's doing to gain that cultural perspective. So, what does this all mean? We can tell from this that these ancient people probably respected those who triumphed out of violence or chaos, right? One of the things that they probably held dear was that cunning, or the ability to see when somebody is trying to deceive you is very important. Anyway, yes. So from all that, we can kind of get a small sense of what the people who would have regularly partook in this mythology probably valued culturally. And then next, we're going to be looking at Theogony. Theogony is a very long story. It is basically the creation myth from the Greeks, about how the world was born, how the gods came to be, and then eventually how humanity came to be. Although humanity is not in this one, actually. I apologize. So, what was weird with Theogony? Something that is very interesting to me. Interesting and weird are very similar to me, because if I find it weird, I'm going to find it interesting in these stories. But anyway, the idea that life is born through war and chaos, and by that I mean throughout these stories, whenever there is a large war or chaos or huge event, more life seems to be born from it than there was before, right? It started with Gaia and the heavens, Earth and the heavens, right? And then they created their first offspring. When that offspring fought back, they created the gods. Once the gods fought back, they created humanity and the earth and everything like that, right? There is an idea throughout these stories that there's more life born from the ashes of chaos than there is from cultivated growth, if that makes sense. Who speaks throughout the story? Well, many gods receive dialogue throughout this story, as well as titans, but by far Zeus speaks the most. He's just like Marduk with Enuma Elish. Zeus is very important in these stories and was very revered by the Greeks. What is repeated? Well, throughout this story, you can see the temperament and fickleness of the gods start to come out. They're powerful, they bestow gifts, but they also have wrath and vengeance, right? And the whole beginning of the story is how they came to be, how through war they came to be the gods of our world or the earth. And then what receives a long description. This is kind of a joke for me. In Greek stories, they really like to emphasize each of the gods. They say every name possible for them. It's a brag rag, right? The more names that you know and the more titles that you know for a god, the cooler you were. But I do believe there is kind of a reason to this. The more names and the more ways you can refer to a god, the more ways that you're flattering them, correct? You're appeasing to their image, you're spreading their word. And so I feel like part of the reason that each time that a god is brought up in these stories and they receive such a long description is partially to appease and hopefully not gain the ire or the wrath of that god. So what does this all mean? Well, we can assume that the Greeks kind of valued bravery through war and chaos. They valued things like benevolence from their gods. One thing that we'll see later on and more pronounced is the fact that they are trying to appease these gods, right? The story of Theogony kind of sets the basis of why the gods are to be feared and why they are the current quote-unquote rulers of the world or the realm. And that will bring us to the selection from Hesiod Works and Days. So what was weird in this one? The lesson from the story in ways kind of conflicts with other Greek myths, but doesn't at the same time. So Greek myth is always a kind of cautionary tale. If it's not a tale of heroism, it's more cautionary, more often than not, of the god's wrath, of the god's fickleness, right? But in many of the Greek myths that I've seen, sometimes you have to go against the gods to follow your destiny or whatever your path might be, correct? But in this, the selection from Hesiod Works and Days, we're just told that we need to accept our subservience to the gods, basically. And I find that very interesting. Who speaks in the story? Well, in this collection of stories, the only two to speak are Zeus in Pandora's Jar and the hawk in the folktale or the fable of the nightingale and the hawk. I think this is kind of meant to happen. I think that this hawk actually is kind of, in essence, a metaphor or a symbolism for the gods. What is repeated throughout the story? The fact that what is received by the gods is much more meaningful than things that you've earned. That sounds weird, but if something is gifted upon you by the gods because you did something that they appreciated or liked, that is technically supposed to be the utmost honor. Even better than anything you could earn yourself. And then what receives a long description? I believe that the creation of man, or the age of man description, receives a long description. I believe this is just because from this selection, this is kind of the purpose piece. This is the purpose that man exists. So what does this all mean? Well, from this story, we can tell that Hesiod was very traditional. We can tell that he was very much preaching that you needed to appease the gods, you needed to live a traditional life, and you needed to continue doing everything to appease and gain the favor of the gods instead of living your own destiny or following your own path, right? So, with all of that, that will bring us to our analysis. In this, we just ask a couple of questions that can be used to compare and contrast these two stories, or these four stories, in fact. So, what was to be learned from the story? In Genesis 1 through 3, we learn how the world and humanity was created. In Enuma Elish, we learn how the gods, the world, and humanity get created. In Theogony, once again, how the gods and humanity are created. And then in Hesiod Works, we see we are learning that the gods are fickle beings and must be appeased. What did the story focus on? The creation of Earth and humanity in Genesis 1 through 3. In Enuma Elish, it focused on the story of Marduk and the Anunnaki. In theology, it was focused on the creation of the gods and how the world came to be. And then in the Hesiod Works, we are focusing on tradition and how to appease the gods, as well as a couple of stories of warning. How was conflict resolved? So in Genesis 1 through 3, I didn't really touch on this too much, but there is a conflict in which the punishment of Eve is the resolution. In Enuma Elish, through war, violence, and chaos, eventually Marduk succeeds and gets to build his temple and do, live his life and create humanity and be the ruler. In Theogony, we kind of see the same thing as in Enuma Elish, but this one is through strength, cunning, and deception. And then finally, in Hesiod Works, I believe that the conflict, and this is more of a metaphorical or metaphysical, I'm not sure how to say that, but the conflict in this, I believe, is the conflict of accepting your role in subservience to the gods, or trying to be your own person and live the life you feel you're supposed to live. And then conflict is resolved in these stories through accepting your role in service to the gods. And then how were humans created? In Genesis 1 through 3, by God to be in their image. In Enuma Elish, with the blood of King Nu. Theogony, it's not explored how humans are created in Theogony, but in the Hesiod's works, humans or man is born from Kronos and eventually, or born from Kronos originally, and eventually is continued to be born from Zeus. And it's a very interesting story in and of itself. But anyway, with this comparative table, we can see that across the board with Genesis, Enuma Elish, and Theogony, they're meant to be creation stories. They're meant to give ancient peoples a sense of how the world came to be. And then we can also make connections between Enuma Elish and Theogony being stories of war and creation. We can also make connections between Genesis and the Hesiod works, because they both give, as well as Enuma Elish, because all three give a purpose or a reason for why humanity exists. In Enuma Elish, it's to serve the Anunnaki, as well as Hesiod Works. And then in Genesis, it's to take care of the garden of God. But more importantly, we can see where these stories contrast, no matter how similar they might be. Although they're all creation, between Theogony, Enuma Elish, and Genesis, there's a lot of differences. There's a lot of contrasting thoughts and opinions. In Enuma Elish, it is very valued to be, I guess, strength, brave, or I'm not sure how to say that. But the constant thought of, you have to be constantly on the lookout. You have to be ever vigilant. That's what I was looking for. You have to be ever vigilant, because there are always people looking to deceive and cause chaos, right? But in Genesis, we're taught that the world was a place without evil, and there was no chaos, and bad things only happen because of the apple. And, you know, it's very interesting to see how these contrast and compare. But next up, we're going to look at adding a modern narrative. The narrative I've chosen for this one is Jack Kirby's New Gods. The reason I've chosen this narrative because I feel like comic books are the best and closest thing to mythological narrative we have nowadays. It's not very often that modern people use scientific or use out of the ordinary or mythological fictional things, but these comic books constantly tap into superpowers, gods, things that we do not believe actually exist in the real world, but have strong connections to mythology. So with a little bit of backstory on this, the New Gods / the Fourth World, it's very transitional. Basically, there is a collection of comics from the artist Jack Kirby that, although are focused on heroes and how they're saving, people, there is a sense of myth behind it. So, before all creation existed in this cosmic, desolate space, there was a spring of power, of cosmic energy. And as, creatures and people started showing up, what were known as the old gods were the first to tap into this energy. And because of that, they were gifted with unimaginable power from this cosmic spring, right? These old gods are known as, or the old gods and the world that they live on are known as Asgard. Asgard is known as the first world, and as they prosper and grow as a civilization, a second planet is born, and eventually there's a civil war between the two planets, eventually just destroying each other. From that war, a cosmic energy is released and comes across Earth. And that's how we have life start to grow on Earth, according to his comics, right? And then, eventually, and it's unclear how it happens, the remnants of those first two worlds that went to war kind of reformed into two new planets, and they are now known as Fourth World. It was on this Fourth World that Darkseid, who is kind of the main antagonist throughout the entire overarching story, is born. And this is where he actually destroyed the rest of the old gods. So, with all that backstory, I highly suggest, if you're interested at all, you take a look into this. It's a very interesting topic to read about, or watch a YouTube video about. But anyway, with all this backstory done, we can kind of take a look at this culture. For cultural analysis, we can see, what is weird. Darkseid's quest is intended to be meaningless. Darkseid, throughout his journey, is looking for what is known as the anti-life equation, or anti-life formula. And this is supposed to completely allow him to take control of everything, any living thing in the universe, and override their free will. But what's very interesting is his quest is intended to be meaningless at the end. Not meaningless as he won't achieve it, but meaningless as it doesn't provide the results that he wanted. It's also very interesting that the basis of this story is that these new gods that are extremely powerful from the new fourth world are trying to protect Earth, which is supposed to be this more primitive planet to them, from a war raging on in their own world. It was very interesting to me. And, you know, comics are very up and down, taglined. Just found that very interesting. While this version of the story is mainly a dialogue telling of a story, we often see the thoughts of Darkseid and Highfather, who are brothers and who are the main protagonist or the main two conflicting sources throughout this story. And then throughout the stories of the fourth world, there is a repeating theme of hopelessness, right? Darkseid's quest is meaningless. The hero's ultimate fight, against Darkseid seems helpless, and the thought that the Earth would be hopeless without the help of Fourth World and their godly heroes all kind of play into these cultural images of almost fighting against a tide that you can't control. It's very interesting. This we can kind of look into the comparative analysis. Just take the same exact questions from before, but we're adding modern narrative to it. So what was learned from this story? In the fourth world, we kind of learned that the pursuit of power and absolute control is a meaningless venture. What did this story focus on? Well, it being a character, a comic book, they focus on acts of heroism and bravery and I believe it's to provide a sense of duty. Provides you a sense of something to look up to, something to emulate, and to be a better person, for lack of a better word. How is conflict resolved? Well, in this one, there is no resolution. Darkseid eventually finishes his quest, and he is unsatisfied. And I feel like that in itself is how the conflict is resolved. It teaches you that sometimes you cannot resolve what's going on. And then in this, how are humans created? It's very interesting, and why I chose this is because that release of cosmic energy from the civil war between the first two worlds creates Earth, creates humans, creates humanity. It's very interesting to me. So, everything I've gone over, this whole half hour of me talking, why does this all matter? It matters because without these mythological stories, these ancient people would have had no way to understand the world around them, right? Something that I've said in this class a couple of times is the fact that we as humans can't accept when something is just the way it is. So we need a reason for why it is. These stories provided ancient people that reason. While we in modern days may not accept that as okay or a reason, they did. And it gave them something to look up to, values to use to shape their culture and their personalities, their characteristics around. And it's very interesting. Modern narrative is very interesting with this too, in the fact that we use these mythological styles to create entertainment now. And it's very different, but the same. right? Just as I was exploring with Jack Kirby's comics, there's some similarities between that and the mythology we went through today, but at the same time, there's a ton of differences. I think that these cultural and comparative analyses do help you, in a way, point out things that you might not have without them, and it does help you kind of compare and contrast the stories, especially with something as hard to read as mythology. So I'll end it there. Thank you so much. And yes, next slide will be my references. I know this was a long one. I hope you enjoyed. Please let me know how I can do better for it on the next one. Thank you so much.